Hi, I'm Dave Maynard, and this class is Prove to Me That God Exists. The first session, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction into apologetics. Apologetics is a word that just means in defense of. So apologetics as applied to Christianity means this is in defense of Christianity. Have you ever had someone say to you, "Prove to me that God exists"? How do you feel when they say that? Do you feel like a deer in the headlights? I mean, how do you answer this? Where do you start? It is a hard question to answer. Well, sit back, relax, take a deep breath, and we'll discuss it. First, let's discuss why we should even answer this question. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." Isaiah 1:18 says, "Come, let us reason together." So we need to be able to answer some of these questions, or at least recommend some resources for the person asking him to look at. The second thing is, try to determine if the person really wants to hear your answer. Now, this could save you a lot of time and frustration. Let him know that a question like this cannot be answered in just one or two sentences or 1 or 2 minutes. Your answer is going to take some time. Are they willing to take that time? Are they willing to spend time in reading some websites or some books? If they're not, you've just saved yourself a lot of time, effort, and frustration. It's been my experience that most people will drop out at this point. Basically because they're not really interested in doing the work required. They know what they believe and they don't want to believe anything different. But if they are interested, you've got to set the agenda. Don't let them dictate the terms of the conversation. If you do, you'll get bogged down with a whole bunch of picayunish, never-ending questions, mostly from the Old Testament about, well, why did God do this? And, well, do you think that's fair of God to do this? So you've got to take charge and set the agenda. As I just said, apologetics is the name of the branch of theology concerned with the defense of Christianity. Luke 12:30 says, "To love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." So you got to use this up here. The object of apologetics is not to convince a person against their will to become a believer, but to lay evidence in an intelligent way so people can understand what's real and what's true. Theologian Clark Pinnock said, "The heart cannot delight in what the mind rejects as false." Let's start out by defining truth. And I know you might say, "Oh boy, we're going to get all involved in a philosophical debate." Well, kind of, but not really. Truth is a noun. It's the real state of things. It's the body of revealed events or facts, something that agrees with reality. What methods can we use to determine if something is true? Well, surprisingly, there's not just one method, there's 2 methods. And you got to know which one to use. And most people always want to use the first one. And there's a lot of cases where you just can't use it. The first one is the scientific method. The second one is the legal historical method. Now, the scientific method has 3 components to it. Number 1, you have to observe an event. Number 2, you have to measure that event somehow. And then number 3, you have to be able to repeat that event. So you've got to be able to repeat the observation and the measurement. So if I throw a ball off a cliff, I'm observing the event, or somebody else is. They're measuring it. At what angle do I throw it off at? With what force do I throw it off at? How far will the ball go? We can do all that. Then we have to repeat that event. And in repeating it, then I can figure out a lot of the things about the event. I know what force I have to use. I know what angle I need to throw at. Then I'll know how far it will go off. If you don't have all 3 of these components, you can't use the scientific method. That will come as a shocker to some people. An example, because Thomas Edison and his scientists were able to observe, measure, and repeat experiments, they were able to produce a longer lasting light bulb and a bunch of other inventions, the phonograph and other things like that, which we now know as a record player, which doesn't even exist anymore. But done right, the scientific method is almost 100% accurate all the time. Some examples of using the scientific method would be for architects who are building bridges or buildings, rocket scientists launching rockets, auto manufacturers making automobiles. But you can't use the scientific method to prove that you were born, or that Abraham Lincoln even existed, or that somebody murdered somebody else, or that somebody loves you or trusts you. You can't use a scientific method because you cannot observe, measure, or repeat those events. So anything in the legal field, or anything in the historical field, or even anything in the intangible field like love, trust, anything like that, you can't use the scientific method on. Now, you can use some scientific test, but you can't use the scientific method itself. The legal historical method, this is used to determine the validity of an event that cannot be repeated. When using this method, we depend on the probability of an event happening based on all the facts that we can gather up. This method is not 100% accurate, but it depends on proving the reality of an event beyond a reasonable doubt, but not beyond any doubt. We reach that decision of the trustworthiness of the event by seeing where the preponderance of the evidence leads to. Examples of the legal historical method being used is in a courtroom when you're deciding whether somebody is guilty or not. In reconstructing history, like did George Washington exist? Did Julius Caesar exist? Things like that. Or in the intangible things like love, friendship, trust, faith. In other words, how do you know somebody loves you? You can't observe love. You can see the effects of love, but you can't see love itself. You can't measure it. We don't know, love weighs how many pounds. But you can observe the effects of love. I know my spouse loves me because we've been married 42 years. She has stuck by me in thick or thin, and a lot of the things she does lets me know that she loves me. But I can't see into her mind to see her actual thoughts. And again, I can't weigh love. So, like I say, you can use some science, like DNA evidence, to support the legal historical method in determining the truth of something. But the final answer will still be not without some doubt. Hopefully it'll be with reasonable doubt. How would you answer questions like this? When we're talking about proving the existence of God, or how the universe began, or how human beings were created, which method would we use? The scientific method or the legal historical method? Right, the legal historical method. Why can't we use the scientific method? We can't observe God. We can see his effects maybe, but we can't observe him. How did the universe start? We weren't there to observe it. We couldn't take any measurements as to how it began, and we definitely can't repeat it. Now let's deal with some specific questions that people would ask, like, prove to me scientifically that God exists. You can't. Why not? Because you can't use the scientific method to prove that God exists, because you can't measure, or you can't observe, measure, or repeat seeing God exist. You have to use the legal historical method. Do you think most people are aware of these two types of proof, and where they can and can't be used? It's been my experience that the answer is no. They're not aware of them. They think the only method of proof is a scientific proof. I think what they really are meaning is, can you show me logically or rationally or credibly how God could exist? I think that's the real question they have, but they're just always thinking, well, but it's got to be scientific. Well, not according to the scientific method. Now, once your method of proof is determined, you can ask them, okay, what subject area do you want proof in? I've also found this is going to stump them. They're just going to say, well, just that he exists. Well, okay, but there's a lot of different areas. Like there's the historical area, there's the archaeological area, there are the classical or the philosophical arguments, there's a prophetic probability argument, there's a scientific argument, there's a sociological, psychological type of proof. In other words, this is a big field. So you want to narrow it down to one field. Then you can start doing the work. Now, in this class, we've produced a very, very brief synopsis of each of these areas. So, partly so you and your friend won't be overwhelmed. When your friend picks this area, then you can start by explaining what the synopsis says. But here's a key thing. Be sure that he applies the same critical thinking skills to this area that he does when he's talking just about other areas in general. In other words, if you're talking about history, make sure he's not more critical with you than he is with other aspects of history. So if you want to say, okay, let's take a look at the historical method of proof, and you start bringing up these historical aspects, and he starts arguing with you right away, you can just say, okay, then if you don't believe that Jesus existed because of all of the things I'm going to say, then you're telling me Rome didn't exist, or that Caesar didn't exist, or that George Washington didn't exist, because we can apply the same. I just want to make sure that he applies the same rules for all of those things which, let's face it, he believes existed, to the fact of Jesus' existence or God's existence, that sort of thing. This is a very important point, as most skeptics are much more critical with the biblical aspects than with the same subject area, than with a different subject area in the same area. Finally, don't worry if you don't know all the answers. Nobody does. But you can lead them to consider some things that they probably have never considered before, even if they tell you they have. I mean, because they don't want to sound dumb. You can also give them additional resources to study. Remember, the goal is not to win an argument. but it's to give them a foundation for believing in Jesus. What they do with it then is up to them. You may never know. 10 years from now, they may be thinking about all this and they may be ready to receive that information, and they might think back on their conversation with you and say, you know, he said a lot of things that make sense. I mean, I didn't want to admit it to him at that point, but he did. A lot of that stuff made sense. Again, in each of these areas, we've only presented a very brief analysis. There is so much more evidence that could be considered. In fact, in each of these areas, you have scholars that have devoted their entire life to that one area. There's that much proof. So when you add up all these proofs, all this evidence, we think God's existence is easily proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, that's it for our introduction to apologetics. We'll see you next session. Bye-bye.